So for folks of you who are just tuning in, this is the podcasters panel. These are all folks that I know that are passionate about cats and very active with animal welfare podcasts. They're all good friends of mine, and we chat a lot, we share a lot, which is wonderful because that's what we're all here for. So before I ask you all questions, I'm going to go around the room and you can just share a little bit about your podcast and a little bit about what you do. I am going to start with Chris with a K.
Yeah, all right. Thanks for having me on, Stacy. Really appreciate it. My name's Chris McCauley. I run the Paw Awareness Podcast, and it's just a passion project shining the light on not only the animal rescue crisis in America, but also the amazing people in the community as well. And I learn a ton. I really didn't know much before getting into the podcast, and I look at it as I get to learn something new every day and then share it with other people. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks, Stacy.
Yep. John Dunn.
Yeah, well, I wish you had not called on me because mine is very similar to Chris's, right? I mean, I work for Best Friends Animal Society. We're a national animal welfare organization. I think you've had some people, Stacy, over the last couple of days from Best Friends speaking, so hopefully everybody got to hear from them. And I'm part of a team called the Best Friends Network, which is a way that we at Best Friends are able to partner with organizations, shelters across the country. We've got today over 3,200 network partners. And there are lots of benefits to becoming a network partner. And one of the things that we do offer is content. We want to help people save more lives, be more effective, whether it's cat life saving or field services or anything else. So we, like I said, we do editorials and other kind of written pieces. And when COVID started, we were like, maybe we should do a podcast. Hey, let's do a podcast. So here we are. Now it's been 2 years and we're approaching episode 100, and it's just been very exciting to be able to do something I enjoy, which is talk and get paid for it and really contribute to life saving in the best way that I know how, because I am not at all able to do any of the things that anybody out there does on a day-to-day basis. So really a pleasure for me to be able to do a podcast that talks about the issues that we all care about, and hopefully along the way can help someone be a little bit more effective in what they do.
Excellent. And thank you to Best Friends Animal Society for being a lead sponsor of the online cat conference this weekend too. So it's been great. Bonney Brown, who Humane Network is also a sponsor of the online cat conference.
Hi, yes, thank you, and great to see all of you today. We at Humane Network have the Shelter Success Simplified Podcast. It started, the first episode, I should say, aired in June 2020, so it's still pretty young and new and very similar to everyone else. Our objectives are to help people. We try to keep our format really concise so you could hopefully listen to it on a break or on your drive, and it's very similar to everyone else. We do tend to try to focus on management and leadership concepts.
And tell us a little bit about Humane Network and what you do as part of Humane Network.
Yeah, well, we work with organizations across the country to do their work more efficiently and effectively. We are a nonprofit and we offer affordable consulting services, everything from fundraising to, assessing how things are going or recruiting board members or staff. We have a wide range of services, and our goal is to help nonprofits and animal services agencies do their work better, more effectively, and save more lives.
And then we have Chris over there with Dubert.com. Dubert is an incredible partner with the Community Cats podcast. He's been a supporter of our efforts probably almost since day one, as far as I can tell. And so Chris has been just a great support mentor. I learn from him all the time, as I learn from everybody else in this virtual room too. Chris, tell us a little bit about Dubert and your podcast.
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Stacy, for having me. And I got into podcasting because of you, so I have you to thank for that. So I've been doing podcasts for years, but the current show that I do is called the Animal Innovation Show. And the idea behind it is I interview people that have products and services and even just ideas, anything that's innovating and helping animals and the people that love them. That's what we focus on. So it airs twice a week, Tuesday, Thursday night, and then we've got the edited versions that run on all the platforms, the other days of the week. So I do that, and then in my spare time, in addition to my day job, I continue to build out Dubert. So Dubert is online technology tools for rescue shelters and all the other wonderful people out there that are helping animals. We've got over 35,000 volunteers, 5,000 organizations. We're the only software that does transport, foster management, and now case management. So really excited to continue to bring the tools that people need to save more lives.
All right, so my question for the group, I know a lot of you've said that you started this podcast, your podcast, because you had a passion, but why podcast? I mean, was it, what was the impetus? I mean, did you listen to in my case, I was listening to podcasts all the time in the car, driving back and forth from Massachusetts to Vermont. And then my 13-year-old son at the time said, "Hey, Mom, I can set you up with a microphone and you should have a podcast." And so it was because of my 13-year-old son that I wasn't going to say no to him, right? You don't say no to your kid. And so I started it back in 2016, sort of because of that, as well as I had a list of 400 organizations that wanted mentoring help. And so I sort of had this collection of needs that I wasn't able to serve as I had left the day-to-day runnings of the Merrimack River Feline Rescue Society. Did any of you, I guess, to use the Maddie's terminology of aha moments, did any of you have an aha moment and say, "Oh, this is convincing me to start a podcast"? Who wants to jump in on that one?
So I'll jump in. I mean, I started listening to podcasts during my morning workouts. I did, Stacy, discover your podcast, and then you had me on as a guest. And honestly, I had a good time with it. And I thought, what can I do with this? Because it was something I didn't know a lot about, is how to produce a podcast. So I'm one of those crazy people that goes, if I don't know anything about it, then I just figure it out. And literally that's kind of what I had to do, is go figure it out. And it became a challenge. And then we went from 1 podcast to 3 podcasts. And all of a sudden, it's this whole production thing. So for me, it really was after being on your show saying, there is more that I can do. There is more knowledge that I can bring and share, and more guests that I can bring and share with our community. And so that's kind of what started it.
That's great. So for us, I think, Stacy, it was the concept that, I love podcasts and listen to them all the time, different ones, including all of yours, but, outside the field too. And leadership and management are hard, especially in our field. And so that's why we chose to kind of focus on that concept, in order to give people little bits of advice that we hope are helpful, and also some moral support and inspiration. And so that was our motivation. I mean, I think that there already, with all of you guys, are great podcasts out there about animal welfare and covering a broad variety of topics and focuses, but that was our focus.
John?
Yeah.
Or go, Chris. Go, Chris.
Go, Chris.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, for me, it was just, I ran a YouTube channel centered around my business, and I was already at the shelter, like actually helping out and whatnot. But I was always thinking in the back of my mind, like, I wonder how I can reach more people and make a bigger impact. And then COVID happened, and just, I don't know, I just thought, well, hey, maybe this is a way that I can still fulfill that part. Like, that was one of my favorite parts of the week, was going to the local rescue and just helping out. And I thought, well, hey, maybe I can do this. And it was one of those, I get these like light bulb moments where, like, I'll wake up at 3 a.m. and just be obsessed with something. And this was one of those, and it just kind of happened. I just acted on it. So yeah, really grateful I did, because I realized I learned so much. There's so much I didn't know, and I get to talk with some amazing people every single week. So.
Yeah, I mean, for me, so I used to be a radio news journalist before I got into animal welfare. I worked in Salt Lake City, was the last place I worked for KSL, and I was a volunteer with No More Homeless Pets in Utah, which today is Best Friends Utah. One thing leads to another. Get drunk at a fundraiser, all of a sudden this is my job. But when I started at Best Friends in animal welfare, there wasn't a lot of like, well, let's take your radio background and have you do radio at Best Friends. Like, that wasn't really a thing, right? And I'm not sure that I wanted to do it either, to be fair. I was looking for a career change. And so now here we are so many years later coming back to it. But like I say, with the network and the growth and things that were happening with COVID, I think Best Friends, we were trying to understand how can we give people what they need. I mean, think about those earliest days, even the first year of COVID, how nuts everything was, like not knowing almost day to day, policy wise, how are we dealing with all of this? And when people are getting things figured out, how do we help share that, right? So that we're all kind of getting this together. And how can we, what do we have currently that we can help do that with, and what do we need? And so there was this idea of, well, what if we did a podcast? And so that was it. It was kind of look around the room and, hey, John Dunn, you used to do radio. How about you do this? And, I mean, I don't know. Chris, you and I have talked about this. Stacy, you and I have talked about this as well. It was fast from idea of, hey, we should do this podcast to actually publish a podcast. It was a few weeks and it was a lot. But it's been worth every minute, just like you all have said. I mean, the ability to meet and connect with people and hear what they're doing is really, it's left a big impression on me in a big way. Really, it really has. It's incredible what everybody does. And like I say, I feel such a huge amount of honor to be able to share those stories and do something that I enjoy as well. I mean, can you even believe we get paid for this? It's nuts, isn't it?
So
you get paid? Huh?
I know.
How does that work?
We're not going to go down that road, right?
Chris, making insane choices to do 7 podcasts and 12 apps and I don't even know what else you're doing. I don't think you get to act like a victim at this point. Okay.
When I started the podcast, Kristen she'll be laughing in the background right now, but it started a 5-day-a-week podcast is when I started out with.
I remember that.
And,
yeah, we did 2 a week. That was a terrible idea. Terrible idea.
So, and supposedly it's something like 50% or some crazy number like that of podcasts don't make it past the 7th episode.
Yeah.
So
I mean, 80% of them are gone in year 1. So
right. So we are all in the winner circle for sure with regards to longevity for podcasts. And I was going to actually say that I know of at least 2 podcasts off the top of my animal-oriented podcasts that have closed shop, basically. And I'm sure there are more out there that I don't even know of. But the life cycle of a podcast is really challenging. But I want to ask, how do you find your guests? I mean, I have people who email me directly and propose an idea. And I like that because it's fresh, it's somebody new, it's maybe nobody's heard of them and that kind of thing. Do you have a specific way of sourcing your guests, or do you sort of have random acts of approaches?
I use LinkedIn. LinkedIn is probably the best thing. If you go to your LinkedIn page, you just kind of keep scrolling down. It starts recommending people for you to connect with, because it looks at all the other types of people you're connected with. And I literally just use that, and I go through every once in a while and I send out a bunch of notes, requests, and just say, hey, I do this podcast, would love to have you on. And I get a 90+% response rate. So works out great.
That's fantastic. John, I would assume you get many of your folks from the Best Friends Network, or is that not that strategic? Yes?
No, it is. Yeah. I mean, listen, it's the Best Friends podcast, and I'm always going to be very sort of boastful about my coworkers, because I think my colleagues are the smartest, coolest people on the face of the earth. But it wouldn't be a very good podcast, I don't think, if 100% of the guests were just best friends people. So we're very aware of that. But at the same time, I do have this incredible pool of people to talk about all of these different issues. But we do want to feature partners, but that's also not a requirement either. It's a little bit of both. Sometimes we'll do something where it's around just a specific person. I don't know, Ed Jameson, for example, Dallas Animal Services, now at Operation Kindness in Dallas. Ed is a leader, and he's a titan in the industry, right? So let's just get Ed and chat with him and turn that into an episode, and we'll talk about lots of different stuff. But a lot of the episodes, most of them are issue-based, so we'll talk about community cats. Okay, what exactly are we going to talk about? Who do we think would be good for that? Is this something we want to talk to somebody internally? Is there a partner? Is there somebody else entirely? So it's kind of all across the board, but we do really try to be very mindful about who we have on and why, because that's the whole episode, right? So if you're not making good choices around that, you're not really going to be doing very well.
What about you, Chris, with a K?
Yeah, I have an assistant, and he reaches out to people on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, and there's usually a list of criteria I give him, and then he'll once he compiles a list, he'll send it back to me. with some notes. And then I'm like, okay, let's reach out to, maybe half these people. And then referrals too. Like after I have someone on the podcast, it's amazing people who are just like, hey, like you should totally reach out to this person. And that's been a great way to meet some amazing people as well. So I would say that's like the process of how we do things over here.
Bonney?
So my colleague Mark Robinson and I both keep an eye out for potential guests, and basically we're looking for interesting people to have on, and we usually ask them what they would like to talk about, keeping in mind that the interview format's really concise and short, and that the target is leadership and management of animal welfare organizations. So we just reach out to people all the time, and I don't know, that's hope we get enough folks to agree to be on.
So I sometimes get questions from organizations about whether or not they should start their own podcast. Do you envision sort of animal welfare podcasting sort of in a way to benefit an individual organization? We got Bonney blinking in and out here. I don't know. She's like, ooh.
Yeah, I'm not sure. She's there and then she's gone.
I'll start with this one. I think there are, this seems like, so I used to do social media for Best Friends. Goes back a long, long time, back when MySpace was a thing. And that was often a question, still is, right? Like I have limited resources and with a small organization, we want to do social media. Where do we put our time? And this is a communication channel. I think probably that same question, some of the same questions you would ask yourself about that. Do you have the time? Do you have the money? Do you have the know-how? And what are you already doing? Where would this fit amongst that? So I think for a lot of organizations, it's probably not going to be a great thing to do, I would say. But that's not necessarily the case for all. But then there's that next question of, well, who is it for, right? I think everybody on here, we're all the B2B side, if you will, not really the B2C. I mean, in terms of our podcast, I always try to make it approachable that anybody could listen to it if they're a volunteer, a board member, people who aren't like embedded in the industry, even Best Friends members, anyone who's interested in animals and what's happening in animal shelters. And but yeah, so know your audience. And I think the other nonprofits, animal welfare organizations I see with podcasts are much more B2C, and that might be a viable option. Not every podcast has to be an hour-long episode. Something we've been talking about at Best Friends is there something we could do where, a minute, we could do 5 episodes a week of a minute about a particular animal that is very much engineered for the Best Friends membership audience, our donors, so that they can really, hear these great stories about what's happening with the animals in our care. So there are ways to do things like this that don't carry the crazy amount of work that I know all of you put into this. Would be much less work, but still, I think you really have to ask yourself all the other things you're doing and where would this fit within that?
I'm just going to say I'm B to T, business to trapper.
That's a good one. I haven't heard that one yet. It's a good one, Stacy. So just building off of what John said, I want to say a couple of things. I guess if you think about a podcast in the traditional sense, right? Like what we're all doing, weekly shows, specific format, you would have to ask yourself or your organization, what's our target? Who are we trying to get on? What are we trying to do? But I guess I would also encourage people to think about the podcast as just a platform. There's nothing that says you can't record 6 episodes and do training, and it's a cheap and easy way to record and have it out there for anybody to access. You can link them on your website and you're good to go. So think of it in a different way. Instead of it being you have to be on a regular show schedule, you can use it to document things, capture things that it's almost like I could imagine doing onboarding or training or things like that. It makes it readily accessible to anybody that has an iPhone or an Android phone. So just something to think about.
Now you have something called RescueTube.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you, Stacy. So one of the tools we built on Dubert is RescueTube, and the whole concept behind it is to video everything, right? To me, the hardest thing in the world is to get video off of the phone to the computer. So I decided we'd solve that. So you just You go on the Do It system, you create a bucket, it gives you a number, you type the number in the app, and then you can upload videos. You could take videos and upload videos and photos from your phone. So I actually use it for anybody that signed up for Jupiter in the last year. You'll get a nice little welcome video from me, because that's what I use to do it, is I just use our own product. So great thing to use if you need to get video and you want to share video, because it's yours. We put it right back on your dashboard. So get it off that phone.
Chris, could you repeat the name of your podcast? Folks are interested in following it. Chris McCauley.
Yeah, it's the Paw Awareness Podcast. So just paw, like awareness, and you just add a P at the front of it. And I'd like to chime in on this too. I think a podcast is, in terms of, like, I agree with everything that's been said. It's just, I think it's about analyzing who your market's for and what's it trying to do. I think a podcast is one tool in the arsenal of, like I like, for me, this is like one out of, a few different businesses. It doesn't make me any money. And if I can find a way to do it, cheaply, it fulfills me. But I think the most valuable thing are the connections you make. I think if you're trying to like reach a super wide audience, I think TikTok is hands down the best way right now. If you're trying to reach as many people as possible and actually like make some money from that TikTok and funnel it back into your organization. But in terms of like the actual connections, I think podcast is the best way to, you get 20-30 minute conversation one-on-one with a person from that organization. So that's my 2 cents on it.
Bonney, any thoughts?
No, I'm sorry. I missed part of that. My connection suddenly decided to go crazy, so I was trying to deal with that. So I'll pass.
Have you had any organizations, or you and Mark have any organizations express interest in developing a podcast for their own groups?
We have not been approached by anyone wanting to do that yet, but.
So how many of you edit your own shows? And I'm going to put Kristen's hand up. John, you edit your own?
Meaning me personally, or that I have fabulous people? Not me anymore, thankfully.
Yeah. And does anybody use a like a podcasting service like Anchor or something like that?
We use Captivate as our podcast hosting platform.
I just use Zoom.
We use Zencaster and a local producer here in Reno.
And you funnel through Libsyn or other?
Through Libsyn.
So in terms of the podcast guests that you're looking for, you described a little bit about what you were looking for, but maybe even a little bit more detail on, so they could be, can they be, you can just nod. This is like me polling my podcasters here. So can they be individuals?
Yes.
Yes. They can be companies or organizations, or representing a company or an organization. Yes. Can they be a for-profit organization?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Are they specific to a region? I guess I'm addressing that maybe to Chris McCauley. Are your guests from all over? Or are they? I think you're in California, right? So.
Yeah, all over. Yep, they're from all over.
All over. Have you? What are your greatest challenges with podcasting, or what has been your greatest challenge in this process? Anything good, bad? I mean, actually, you can say strengths, weaknesses, anything that stands out, or just a lot of time and energy?
For us, it's time and energy. We, as several people have indicated, you don't really make money doing podcasts for the most part. So, it's something that we believe is a way to disseminate information and help people and connect people, hopefully. So that's how we view it, and finding the time to do it is perhaps the single biggest challenge.
Yeah, I would say our challenge, which is a challenge if anybody's thinking about starting their own podcast, is really around the data part of it. You know, we like to measure everything at Best Friends. We want to make sure that what we're doing is working, but, you know, podcast analytics are terrible. And even if we can say, okay, here are all the analytics we're seeing, we believe these things, and we have lots of people listening, we don't really know what they're doing after they're listening, right? So they downloaded it, and maybe we can have some sense that people are listening and they're listening to the whole episode. That's great, but, you know, we want people to actually learn things and then take what they've learned and save lives. So unless somebody emails and says, hey, you know, we listened to that episode and like totally changed the way we thought about this, we ended up doing this whole different thing with this program, which I'm very proud to say has happened. We don't really know if it's working. So, you know, again, if you're in a position of wanting to make sure that all of the work you're doing is you know, having the biggest impact, I would say keep that in mind. So hopefully someday there'll be a better way to really like tie those things together. But unquestionably time, I mean, it is a lot of work to produce a podcast. It really is.
We have a question in here that I think is really interesting, unless anybody had any other comments about challenges and concerns.
I was going to make one comment, Stacy, and my comment was going to be just to kind of flip it around a little bit. The best way I found to avoid some of the challenges and learnings that I had to go through is develop a repeatable process. Because now that we've got a process down, I mean, I literally can show up 5 minutes before an interview. My team has already produced like the outline and the name, and like I got it all right there. And so I literally get on and talk to them for a few minutes and start recording. But think through how do you make this so that there's a simple process? How do you answer all the guest questions up front, make it stupid easy technology-wise for them to connect with you? And then what's supposed to happen after that? How does it get edited? How does it get shared? All those other things. If you can literally list out step by step, even if it's just you, and make that part, you can start doing things like macros with email and things like that to make things a lot more efficient.
I'll agree with you 100%. And I think one of the best things that I've learned in, I did the Podcasters Paradise, Entrepreneurs on Fire. I did their like basic podcaster training before I even started podcasting. But everything that they kept on saying, every other word was like batch it, batch work, you know. And I've taken that into not only the podcast, but like, okay, so if I have to write grant applications, I'll take, you know, 3 hours and I'll batch it, and I'll do 3 applications in 3 hours rather than like one here and one there and one there. I mean, so sort of transferred a lot of that into time savings for other things that we do. And we all know things are going to happen. We all know kittens are going to be born in the summertime, right? So, you know, we don't have to plan our, you know, reactively do something on July 4th weekend, you know, because we know that there's going to be kittens there. Maybe we don't know the specific kitten story we're going to do, but we can at least sketch out the template, you know, and say, you know, Fred the kitten is eventually going to get this picture in there, whoever that gets determined. But trying to make sure we do stuff in a batched environment so that we're not, when we do have to rush, we're not rushing too much. We do have a question out here that I wanted to make sure, because I think everybody's going to have an opinion on this. Do you ever have someone on your show with opposing views or ideas?
God, I hope so. It's my favorite.
Who have you had on?
We've had a lot of people on. I mean, that's part of, I mean, what's sort of interesting, I mean, that's kind of good, right? Like I'll tell you this week, this week's episode, this last week was with Sue Cosby, who many of you know, was with Petco and Act Philly, and now is with Best Friends. She's director of our life-saving centers. And the conversation was about adopting out unaltered animals. Now, everybody that's on this is like, what are you talking about, Best Friends? Well, unfortunately, with the veterinary resource situation we've got, and length of stays increasing and positive outcomes down, adoptions are down, there are some difficult decisions having to be made at shelters across the country, right? I can send out this animal that will be unaltered to come back and get a surgery when those resources are available. Or if I'm going to be rigid about that policy, that means an animal may not go home at all, right? So that's really the core of that conversation. And that's not an easy conversation to have. It's fraught with all sorts of, you know, opinion. Good, and it's good for that. But, you know, and I think that to me is part of what we can do in podcasting. We can have a long form conversation that is rich and interesting in a way that you don't really get from written words on a page necessarily. So I just think podcasting is a great place to have some of those stickier type conversations.
Anybody else have challenging, interview with different views? I can share one story.
Pretty easy.
What?
So go ahead, Stacey. I was going to say most of mine have been pretty easy. So
yeah, I will tell you, I had a lesson learned early on, and I, for those of you guys have pretty much mostly all been on my show. And I usually have a little conversation before I hit the record button, and I try and sort of cover a little bit of the topics of what we're going to talk about. And I learned this lesson really hard early on. I interviewed a cat organization, and based on what I saw on their website and everything, my homework I had done ahead of time, I thought, oh my gosh, this is the most progressive group. They've got everything going on. They're like, my long lost sister or whatever. And so I'm in the interview, I'm having a recording and doing that. And I asked the question about feline leukemia positive cats, assuming that they adopted them out. And it turned out they did not, and that they euthanized any cats that tested positive for feline leukemia. And I left that content in there because I feel that it's the integrity of the conversation, but I did also share that, I have been very strongly an advocate of adopting out feline leukemia positive cats, since the 90s. But so it made for a very interesting conversation because it was the first time as a podcaster, I had to kind of, in recording, dance around a topic that made me uncomfortable, but it was good because it really showed that we need to be able to have these conversations. And I have no idea if I changed anybody's opinion or changed anybody's protocol, but at least we were having the conversation and it was a public conversation that people were going to hear. But very early on, I felt I didn't want to put that person into a bad, uncomfortable position too, to be honest. So, and luckily it was fine. And I probably was more nervous about it than they were, but it showed to me that as podcasters, we have an obligation to have difficult conversations in a way that is productive and proactive, not confrontational, So that was my lesson learned as a very early podcaster. Let me see if there are any other questions from the crowd. Anything that you guys want to share as podcasters? Subscribers, how do people subscribe to podcasts?
The ultimate question. So everything I've learned is people learn about podcasts from other podcasts is what it seems to be. So you're either pushing it on social media and they're following you there and they're coming out and connecting, or they're hearing about it from someone else. So to me, with this show that we're doing now, we're trying to be on all of the platforms because we do it audio and video. So including the audio only podcast, we're on everything else, right? So we stream it live to Facebook and YouTube, and we have edited versions that goes to Instagram, LinkedIn, all that. So we try to spread it as far and wide as possible to try and draw people in.
Yep. And I still think, since we haven't been going to conferences or anything, we have, Kristen used to go and do a lot of tabling at conferences. I would go to conferences, and at the cat conferences, everybody's like, what's a podcast? What's a podcast? And then you go to the podcasters conferences and they're like, what's a community cat? What's a,
exactly, right?
And so we're like, okay, which hat are we wearing today? Because we were trying before COVID hit, we were trying to get ourselves into the podcasting world because there are not very many animal welfare or podcasts represented out in, I can't tell you how many yoga podcasts there are or how many meditation podcasts there are. There are so many podcasts in other spaces, but tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't get the sense that there's a lot of animal podcasts, animal-oriented podcasts living in like the podcasting space. And I think that's unfortunate. And so maybe we should all, take the mantle and go and hang our flag over there. Because it's educational. I mean, we would get lists of people who were like, oh, let me tell you about my cat. Once they figured out, at the podcasting table, these people all have cats too, as well as podcasting about Star Trek and, Outlander and all that other stuff too. So the podcasting world is very different, but yet very similar, I think. So Anybody have any final comments for the group before we close out, and we're going to move into some cat trivia?
Ooh, cat trivia.
I guess I would just say, if anyone, is out there who feels that they have something helpful to share with other managers or leaders, and by that you could be the leader of a rescue group up to the leader of a huge animal control agency. We have spanned that whole, scope of people. We are, always happy to talk to someone who might like to be on, and I suspect that's true of all of the other folks on here too. We have a kind of, our audience really tends to be the people we are aiming our podcast at, are people who are leaders and managers or want to be leaders and managers of a rescue or an animal welfare organization. But, we are always looking for interesting and new voices. So love to hear from anyone out there.
Anybody want to share anything else? Chris?
Yeah, I do. I guess what I was going to say is, not every podcast has to be an interview style podcast. And so just building on what Bonney said, I mean, if you've got knowledge, everybody's got knowledge and perspective and lessons to be learned. And the best advice I can give you is something, I believe it came from Gary V, who's like big time marketing guy. He said, document, don't create, right? When you think about how am I going to create something, you get inside of how do I, no, and he literally has cameras following around documenting him all day long. And then they slice and dice it up into different podcasts and different videos and different things like that. So if you think about it, every day, if you literally fire up your phone and, record something, you're just documenting what's going on, what's on your mind today, what are you struggling with, what's your challenge. So it doesn't have to be this big production like what we're doing, getting guests and going through all that, because there's a lot of overhead that comes with it. But if you've got some perspective and some lessons to share with the world, I say turn on your phone and do it.
Totally agree with Chris. I, for a while, have wanted to do, and maybe now that we're going into endemic life, maybe we could find a way to pull this off, just a series, of a community, a shelter, creating, implementing, managing a community cat program. What does a 6-7 part series look like that people could, again, we can write playbooks and manuals all day and they have a place, but I think people consume things differently and hear things differently. And I think there's just something very gosh, I don't really know the word, but there's something like almost camaraderie you would feel, right? You could go back and listen and you could feel that kind of same struggle. And here's what we worked. And we could listen to a little bit of the staff meeting they had that day and them talking to someone in the community. So that, again, it's not just a playbook, but that could just be something over like 6 or 7 episodes. It doesn't have to be, like Chris said, episode 112 of the Duber podcast. John Dunn, maybe, probably not. Haven't had that call yet, Chris.
Anything, Chris McCauley, from you? You are an interesting character because you are a podcaster, but you dabble outside of the animal welfare space a little bit too, because you've got an NFT thing going on and some other stuff going on too. So you're not like in it and living it. You're sort of in and out. So I'd be curious to hear what your perspective is.
Yeah. I think you're right. Like I'm very beginner, and this is only done from the fact of that I have an assistant. I've got like maybe 2 or 3 hours a week, like similar to what Chris Roy said. It's like I have to show up to an interview. How can I show up to an interview and basically have like 5 to 10 minutes of prep and like here's who I'm dealing with, because I've got like 4 or 5 other businesses I just don't have the time for. And so, but that for me though has been, it's trickled into all other aspects of my life. So I think it's been really interesting to kind of see that unfold. And what was the original topic question again, Stacy?
We've wandered around.
Yeah, no, I was like all in the conversations. It's awesome.
Yeah. So actually, I think, Bonney was talking about, just to reach out to all of us if you're interested in being a guest. And so I think that's sort of where we were starting out. One question that's coming in, I want to make sure we get to some of these questions here too. How do we handle previously organized podcasts with the ever-changing events happening in the country, pandemic, and changes in the animal welfare space? Well, I can say I think we all handle it very differently because, as many of you know, I record my podcast like 4 to 5 months out. And so I'm way ahead. But what I did during COVID was I had pop-up panels that I ran on the weekends to address COVID. So it was sort of a secondary factor, or it was an additional product. But I did not alter the podcast. I kept those because there are so many hands that have to touch the podcast production. I didn't want to rock that boat because it's like 4 or 5 different hands touch it in the process before it gets out the door. So I didn't want to alter that process. And actually, it was kind of good because it was like normal. I mean, like the pandemic didn't exist during my podcast. So I think that the world kind of liked that. But I did have the pop-up panels. So that's how I approached it. I don't know if you have, you manipulate your shows to be more reactive to current events.
I don't specifically on mine. I mean, I think, you're right, Stacy, you're like 6 months out. We try to keep in the 6 to 8 weeks range out just for that reason, because otherwise things change. And particularly when I have guests on, if they're, innovative or of a product, they want to market it, right? So if, it kind of got a little bit funky when I was recording around, Thanksgiving, and they're like, oh, and it'll be up before Christmas. I'm like, this doesn't air until February, So yeah, it's definitely something you want to keep in mind.
It's amazing how many different ways to do this, isn't there? Because I'm the opposite. I'm like almost not quite week to week, but pretty close. But that's part of it for us, right? Is we want to make sure that we're talking about things that are happening now. With all these COVID changes. I mean, that to the point of the original question, yeah, I mean, something that's an episode from 6 months ago may not be as relevant. We don't go back and change those. It's an old episode, and I do start every episode saying the date, so hopefully people can sort of understand where that episode was in the timeline. But yeah, it's important for us to do it that week to week. I think that's the goal, to provide that kind of current type conversation around things that are happening, and not that that's better or worse than anything else. That's just the way that we've chosen to do it.
Ours is we've had COVID topics, and we've had perennial type topics.
Great. I've got one question here because it's from Kristen. So this will be our last question. But what do you see as the one necessary something to make your podcast successful that is not podcasting itself? Kristen, you might have to unmute yourself and clarify your question, because that doesn't make sense to me.
So what I was asking was what is one thing that you do in the process of podcasting that you credit with helping to make your podcast successful that isn't podcasting directly, like not speaking into a microphone or not doing an interview, but something that makes the podcast successful? Like, do you find that your Instagram is really important? Do you find that choosing the right guests are really important? Do you find that, something you're doing outside, like even if it's just, well, I take 2 days off during the week for self-care and that makes me do better podcasts? Like, what do you credit as like that goes into the secret sauce? Does that make more sense?
I want to hear what John Dunn does. I just want to learn from the master.
I was just going to say sleep, but I don't know if that's.
Yeah, no, that's 100% what I'm asking.
I mean, honestly, the position I'm in, I'm not a frontline person. I've never actually worked in a shelter. So for me, really making sure that I'm keeping up with what's going on, so that when I am speaking to someone, I'm familiar with terminology. I'm familiar with what's happening, like with them and their community. So really just doing the homework. I saw a thing recently, and this guy is one of the bigger podcasters, top 100 type guys. He said that he spends 12 hours prepping for every interview, right? I don't do that. Doesn't sound like y'all do that either. And he's successful. We're successful. So there's so many different ways to do this. But yeah, I think really just making sure that that I'm prepped, that I'm up to date with issues. And so I'm not just saying, what's feline leukemia again? Can you run through that, right? You got to at least kind of know what you're talking about a little bit.
I love the energy from my guests. I just love having the conversations. And I was having a conversation with Kristen, a month or two ago, and I was like, I had done like a couple of days and tons of interviews, like in one big batch or whatever. And I just, you know what? I really love this. I just really love hearing what folks are doing, hearing their stories, learning about all the work that they're doing. There's a lot of similarities, but it's not something you get bored. You get excited because you're so excited that so many people are doing the same good things. And I just felt like I just got all this like energy my way. And I know some people will do like interviews all day long and they'll be tired, but for me, it's not the case. I get all energized. Now, if I was substitute teaching a kindergarten class, I'd be exhausted at the end of the day and I'd be totally non-functioning. But the interview process, to me, just doing the interviews is just so energetic and exciting. And I love it. I could do more podcasts in a week, but I won't do it for Chris's team and
Please
for Kristen. Anybody else have a comment before I switch over to cat trivia?
Yeah, I got something. I think for me, it's just having like a rigorous SOP manual. I have a 10-page SOP manual from start to finish on how a podcast is produced, and like from the research that's done and everything, and just creating SOP manuals in like all parts of my life has been super beneficial. And then just other areas, like it's been crazy how like other businesses have raised, like have people see, oh wow, this guy's passionate about animal rescue. And then people have messaged me like, hey, I was about to like, adopt out this fancy dog, but I listened to one of your episodes and now I'm actually like going this route. And that for me has been pretty big too. So that's all I have to say there.
Yeah, great point.
Cool. Well, podcasters panel, it's great to see you all. Thank you so much for joining us, and I appreciate it very much. Keep doing what you're doing, and we'll make sure that everybody gets the link to all of your shows so we can all subscribe and build up those downloads, right?
That's right.
Not about the size of the download, Stacy.
I know, but it is on our
when you're John
dashboard.
Dunn, it's not about the size of the downloads. Let's just leave it at that.
For the rest of us that are trying to encourage advertisers, maybe we do want the downloads. So
I think I'm going to start advertising in John Dunn's podcast. That's what I'm
Yeah,
thinking.
would you? Actually, I really appreciate that.
all right, everybody, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.